How to say hours, hours, dwell, hours, dwell. How to say water, how to say water, pew, pew. How to say friend, how to say friend, math, math. How to say book, how to say book, book, book is book. How to say time, how to say time, Thok. How to say time, Thok. How to say people, Nath. How to say people, Nath. How to say world, how to say world, Wishmon, Wishmon. How to say food, how to say food, Quen, Quen. How to say food, Quen. How to say money, how to say money, Yo, yo, money, yo. How to say family, how to say family, Jicheng, Jicheng. How to say family, Jicheng, Jicheng. How to say city, how to say city, Rek, Rek. How to say city, Rek. How to say weather, how to say weather, Tapari, Tapari, or we can call it Jom, Jom. We can remove this and we put Jom, Jom. How to say weather, Jom, Jom. How to say journey, journey, Jal. How to say journey, Jal, Jal. How to say think, how to say thing, Char. How to say thing, Char. How to say speak, how to say speak, Raisni, Raisni. Speak, Raisni. How to say listened, how to say listened, Linga, Ling or Linga. Listen, Linga. Listen, Linga. How to say right, how to say it right, Gor or Gwar. Right, Gor or Gwar. How to say learn, how to say learn, Ngach, Ngach. How to say create, how to say create, Shak, Shak. How to say change, how to say change, Ger, Gere. Migar kado change, Ger. How to say understand, Shobluaj. How to say understand, Shobluaj. How to say remember, how to say remember, Tiem or Time. How to say remember, Tiem or Time. How to say choose, how to say choose, Queen, choose, Queen. How to say succeed, how to say succeed, Jekemigwa, Jekemigwa. How to say succeed, Jekemigwa. How to say it helped, helped, Luck, Luck. How to say helped, Luck, Luck. How to say happy, how to say happy, Tesluaj, Tesluaj. Happy, Tesluaj. How to say beautiful, how to say beautiful, Migwa along, Migwa along. How to say different, how to say different, Migul or Mite dag, migul or mitedag. How to say it grateful. How to say grateful. Chiloited. Chiloited. How to say grateful. Chiloited. How to say important. How to say it important. Migwa or mitelwang. Migwa or mitelwang. How to say diligent. How to say diligent. Tin merong. Tin merong or latketit. Diligent. Latketit. How to say it resilient. How to say resilient. Bomluaj. Resilient. Bomluaj or rot. Resilient. How to say simple. How to say simple. Mityak. Simple. Mityak. How to say abandoned. How to say abandon. Mirong. How to say abandon. Mirong. How to say candid. How to say candid. Guansuka. Ramlatsok is candid. How to say candid. Guantuka or Ramilatok candid. How to say serene. How to say serene. Siang mala or siang palpinya. Serene. How to say serene. Siang mala or siang palpinya. How to say brisk. How to say brisk. Mitek. Mipat. Mite. Long. That is brisk. Brisk. Mitek. Mipat. Mitekalwang. How to say it please. Liameji. How to say please. Liameji. How to say because. Keo. Keo. How to say always. Nichang. Nichang. Always. Nichang. How to say never. Kene. Kene. Never. Kene. How to say often. Nichang. How to say often. Nichang. How to say sometimes. Tangwasni. How to say sometime. Tangwasni. How to say between. Come. How to say between. Come. How to say through. Karede. How to say through. Karede. How to say together. Kale. How to say together. Kale. How to say it in a state. How to say in a state. Mindong. How to say in a state. Mindong. How to say almost. Shatiak. How to say almost. Shatiak. How to say quickly. How to say quickly. Kepet. How to say quickly. Kepes. How to say suddenly. How to say suddenly. Guadmetot. How to say suddenly. Guasmetot. Kika guasmetot. Kika guatmetiak. Please help the channel by subscribing. Turn on the notification bell so whenever we upload a new lesson you can be updated. Thank you.